Stop fearing mistakes. Start learning faster. 1. Mistakes are proof of action. If you never fail, you never try. This simple idea showed that mistakes were not a sign of weakness but a sign of movement. When a person made mistakes, it meant that he or she had acted, spoken, or attempted something instead of standing still. Action always carried more weight than perfection because action pushed life forward, while perfection only created endless waiting. Without mistakes, there could be no real progress, because every mistake gave new information, new experience, and a chance to improve. When people started something new, they often wanted to do it perfectly from the first try. They waited for the right moment, prepared endlessly, or kept silent because they were afraid of looking foolish. But by waiting, nothing changed. Their skills stayed frozen at the same level. On the other hand, those who tried, even if they failed again and again, slowly moved closer to their goal. Mistakes marked the steps of that journey, like footprints on the road. Each error was proof that the traveler was walking instead of sitting still. In learning English, this truth was especially clear. A student who tried to speak and made mistakes actually learned more than a student who stayed quiet. Speaking with errors gave the brain real practice. Every wrong word, every broken sentence showed exactly where the problem was, and that became the next lesson. Silence, however, gave no feedback. Silence only kept the student locked inside fear and doubt. The one who spoke, even badly, had already won half the battle. Mistakes also built strength of character. When someone tried, failed, and tried again, they proved to themselves that they were brave. They showed that they were not afraid of discomfort. Over time, this courage created confidence. Each action, each attempt, became evidence that progress was possible. The more mistakes appeared, the clearer the road became. A blurred path turned into a visible direction, and fear slowly turned into energy. So mistakes were not the end of the story but the beginning. They were signs of life, signs of effort, and signs of movement. Every error said, "You are learning. You are changing. You are alive." And in the end, that was always more valuable than standing still and doing nothing. 2. Shift perspective on failure. Failure was often seen as a heavy word, something that carried shame and disappointment. Many people thought that failing meant the end of the road, a clear sign that they were not good enough. But the truth was very different. Failure was not the opposite of success, it was a necessary part of it. Every person who had ever achieved something meaningful had a history filled with failures. These moments were not verdicts, but lessons. They were feedback from life, pointing directly to what still needed to be improved. When a learner of English forgot a word or used the wrong tense, it was easy to call it a failure. Yet in reality, it was a clear signal. That mistake showed the exact spot where more attention was needed. Instead of punishment, it was guidance. Without such moments, the learner would not know where the weakness lay. Failure, then, was not a barrier but a teacher. It carried a message, and once the message was understood, progress could happen. Reframing failure required a shift in thinking. Instead of asking, "Why did I fail?" a person could ask, "What did this teach me?" This small change in perspective transformed negative emotions into positive energy. The missed word, the forgotten rule, or the broken sentence became a map. Each error drew a clearer picture of the journey ahead. Slowly, the learner discovered that every failure was information, and information was power. This perspective also removed the fear of trying. If failure was not final but only a step in the process, then there was no reason to avoid action. Each attempt became valuable, whether it ended in success or in error. The more a person failed, the more information they collected. And the more information they had, the stronger they became. Success, then, was not a sudden event but a long chain of corrected mistakes, one after another, linked together over time. In this way, failure turned into a friend, not an enemy. It was no longer a wall blocking the path, but a signpost showing the right direction. Those who embraced this view carried less fear and more courage. They walked forward knowing that every fall was a lesson, and every lesson carried them closer to success. Failure was not the end, it was simply part of the road that all successful people had traveled before. 3. The growth mindset. A growth mindset was a way of seeing the world that changed everything. People with a fixed mindset believed their abilities were limited and unchangeable. They thought that talent was something you were born with, and if you were not naturally good at something, you could never improve. This belief made them avoid challenges, because every mistake felt like proof of weakness. They protected their ego instead of growing. On the other hand, people with a growth mindset understood that abilities could be developed. They knew that every skill, including language, could be learned with time, practice, and patience. When learners adopted a growth mindset, they stopped fearing mistakes. They no longer saw errors as shameful moments but as useful lessons. Every time they mispronounced a word, forgot a phrase, or made a grammar error, they treated it as feedback. Each mistake revealed where they needed more practice. In this way, mistakes became opportunities, not threats. They were not signs of failure but signs of movement. A learner who made no mistakes was often a learner who never tried, and without trying there was no progress. In the context of English learning, the growth mindset was especially powerful. Many people stayed silent because they wanted to sound perfect. They were afraid that if they spoke with errors, others would judge them. But those with a growth mindset thought differently. They spoke anyway, even if their sentences were broken, even if their vocabulary was small. They knew that fluency was built step by step, and small daily errors added up to long-term mastery. Progress mattered more than perfection. Over time, this attitude created confidence. Learners with a growth mindset felt less pressure, because they understood that mistakes were natural. They did not measure themselves by how many errors they avoided but by how much they learned from each one. Every conversation, every attempt, every practice session became part of their growth. This mindset allowed them to see learning as a journey, not a test they had to pass on the first try. The difference between the two mindsets was clear. A fixed mindset kept people trapped, repeating the same patterns, afraid to step out. A growth mindset pushed people forward, helping them embrace discomfort and challenges. It was the belief that nothing was fixed, that with effort and consistency, improvement was always possible. For learners of English, adopting this mindset meant opening the door to real fluency. It meant seeing every error as a lesson in disguise, and every lesson as a building block of success. 4. Courage over comfort. Comfort had always felt safe, but it was also a silent trap. People stayed in their comfort zones because they feared mistakes, judgment, and embarrassment. They thought that silence protected them from failure, but in reality, it protected them from progress. Growth never lived inside the comfort zone. It waited just beyond it, in the space where fear and uncertainty existed. Choosing courage over comfort was the only way to reach it. Courage did not mean the absence of fear. Fear was always there, whispering doubts and warnings. True courage was the decision to act despite that fear. For English learners, this meant opening their mouths even when they knew their sentences would not be perfect. It meant asking questions even when they risked not understanding the answer. Each small act of courage chipped away at the power of fear and built the foundation of real confidence. The first steps were always the hardest. The heart raced, the mind filled with doubt, and the comfort zone pulled strongly, promising safety. But once a person chose courage and spoke a sentence in English, even with mistakes, something changed. The fear did not disappear completely, but the learner realized they survived it. They discovered that making mistakes was not the end of the world. Instead, each mistake became a milestone, a marker showing how far they had come. With practice, the pattern repeated. Every time they chose courage, the comfort zone expanded. Words came more easily, sentences grew longer, and confidence deepened. Mistakes that once felt terrifying became part of the process. They were no longer monsters hiding in the dark but simple signs of progress. The learner learned to see them as stepping stones instead of obstacles. Courage over comfort became a daily practice, not a one-time decision. It required effort every time fear appeared, but it also gave rewards every time it was chosen. The courage to speak, to try, to fail, and to try again built resilience. It created strength that no comfort zone could ever provide. Over time, those who chose courage discovered they could achieve far more than they once believed. Comfort killed growth, but courage created it, and those who understood this truth unlocked the path to real transformation. 5. Mistakes build memory. Mistakes often carried with them a sharp sting of emotion, and that was exactly why they became powerful teachers. When someone read a word silently and never used it, the word often slipped away from memory. But when they mispronounced it out loud, felt the heat of embarrassment, and then received correction, the memory of that moment became carved deeply into the mind. What they failed at, they remembered best. This happened because the brain was wired to pay attention to moments of strong emotion. A mistake was not neutral, it had weight, it had feeling. That emotional charge acted like glue, making the lesson stick far longer than passive reading or quiet memorization ever could. For language learners, this meant that the very errors they wanted to avoid were the ones that created the strongest and most lasting knowledge. Think about a learner who said a word incorrectly in class. Maybe everyone laughed, or maybe only the teacher corrected them kindly. At that moment, they felt embarrassed, but later they noticed something important. They never forgot that word again. The mistake had burned it into their memory more powerfully than 10 times of silent study. It became a personal victory disguised as a failure. The same pattern happened with grammar, spelling, or even cultural mistakes. When a person used the wrong tense in English and someone corrected it, the brain highlighted the gap. That small pain of being wrong transformed into a marker of growth. The learner carried that correction forward, and the next time they faced the same situation, the right form came to them more quickly. Mistakes also created stories. People remembered not just the error but the context around it, the place, the faces, the emotions. These stories were mental hooks, making it easier to recall the lesson in the future. Instead of seeing errors as scars, learners could view them as anchors that held knowledge firmly in place. Running away from mistakes meant running away from the most powerful tool of memory building. Each failure was a chance to reinforce learning in a way that books alone could never do. The more a learner accepted this truth, the more they embraced errors as allies instead of enemies. They discovered that mistakes were not the end of progress but the very foundation of it. Every corrected error was a permanent brick added to the wall of fluency. 6. Learn by doing, not by waiting. Many learners spent their days waiting for the perfect moment to start. They told themselves they needed more preparation, more study, or more confidence before they dared to use English. But the truth was simple: the perfect moment never arrived. Perfect preparation was only hidden procrastination. Every day spent waiting was a day lost, and no amount of reading rules or collecting vocabulary lists could replace the act of real practice. Real learning happened in motion, not in silence. A person could spend hours studying grammar, but if they never spoke a word aloud, their mouth never learned the rhythm of English. They could memorize hundreds of words, but without writing or speaking them in context, those words remained lifeless, locked away in a corner of the brain. Knowledge without use stayed fragile and weak, ready to be forgotten at any moment. Doing created readiness. Each mistake gave feedback that no textbook could provide. When a learner misused a tense or chose the wrong preposition, the immediate correction became a direct lesson, sharper and clearer than any rule. This process of trial and error built strong connections in the mind. By acting, learners tested their limits, discovered their weaknesses, and turned those weaknesses into strengths. It was fear that often kept people in the waiting stage. They thought they would embarrass themselves, or that others would judge them. But courage was not the absence of fear, it was the decision to move forward despite it. The ones who progressed fastest were not those who waited for confidence, but those who created confidence by practicing, failing, and improving. Confidence was built through repetition, not through waiting. Every language learner who truly succeeded had understood this. They spoke even when their sentences were broken. They wrote even when their grammar was shaky. They listened and responded even when they caught only half of what was said. And with each attempt, they grew stronger. Their progress came not from perfection but from persistence. Waiting killed progress because it froze action. Doing built progress because it created experience. And experience was the only path to mastery. The lesson was clear. Stop waiting for readiness. Start speaking, start writing, start living in the language now. Fluency was not found in the future, it was built in every imperfect action of today. 7. Perfection is an illusion. Many learners believed they had to speak perfectly before opening their mouths. They thought every sentence must be without error, every word chosen with precision, and every pronunciation flawless. This belief placed them in a prison of silence. They corrected themselves again and again in their minds but never dared to speak aloud. Time passed, and while they waited for perfection, progress never came. Perfection was an illusion because it did not exist, not even for native speakers. People who had spoken English since childhood made mistakes every day. They forgot words, mixed grammar, and mispronounced sounds, yet their communication continued. They laughed, repeated, and moved on without shame. Their goal was not flawless speech but clear connection. They proved that perfection was never the requirement for understanding. The chase for perfection created fear and anxiety. A learner who aimed for flawless language carried heavy pressure each time they tried to speak. The mind became tense, the body stiff, and words refused to flow. Instead of feeling free, they felt trapped by their own standards. Each small mistake felt like failure, even though mistakes were natural steps of growth. When the focus shifted from perfection to communication, everything changed. Learners who cared more about being understood than being flawless suddenly found freedom. They spoke with more energy, expressed their ideas, and discovered that people cared about the message, not the errors. Connection became the real goal, and perfection became unnecessary. It was important to remember that fluency was not the same as perfection. Fluency meant the ability to keep moving, to express ideas even with mistakes, and to respond without freezing. A learner who embraced imperfection built confidence faster because they practiced more, spoke more, and interacted more. Each conversation added to their skill, while perfectionists stayed silent and stagnant. Perfection promised safety but delivered nothing. Connection promised growth and delivered confidence. Those who accepted mistakes as part of the journey discovered that English became less of a burden and more of a tool. They were no longer chained by fear of error. They communicated, they learned, and they grew. The illusion of perfection faded, and the reality of progress took its place. 8. Mistakes show you care. When a learner made mistakes, it showed that they had cared enough to try. It meant they had placed effort, time, and energy into expressing themselves. A person who never made errors was usually the one who never opened their mouth, never wrote a line, and never tested their skills in real situations. Silence created no mistakes, but it also created no growth. Errors were not evidence of failure but of investment. Every mistake proved that the learner had chosen action instead of passivity. It revealed a level of courage that silence never required. To mispronounce a word in front of others, to forget grammar rules during conversation, or to use the wrong expression took bravery. Those moments carried vulnerability, but they also carried proof of commitment. Each mistake was a signal. I am trying, I care about improving, and I am willing to risk being wrong to get better. In the process of learning English, mistakes had a deeper meaning. They showed that the learner valued communication more than their comfort. They dared to step outside the safe zone of waiting and entered the uncertain space of speaking and writing. That step, even if filled with errors, deserved respect. Teachers, listeners, and even native speakers could see the courage behind the effort. They often admired the learner for caring enough to communicate, even imperfectly. Caring was the foundation of growth. Without care, there was no reason to practice, no reason to study, and no reason to continue. Mistakes highlighted that the learner had not given up, that they wanted to connect and to learn. They reflected love for the process, dedication to the goal, and seriousness about self-improvement. Even the smallest errors whispered, "This person is on the journey." It was also important to notice that mistakes carried emotional weight. People remembered their errors not because they were shameful but because they mattered. If they misused a word or mixed up tenses, it meant they had truly tried to use the language. That effort created lasting memory. Behind every slip, there was care strong enough to bring the learner closer to fluency. Mistakes were not a mark of weakness, they were evidence of passion. They proved that the learner had cared enough to grow, even when growth was uncomfortable. Each error said more about courage than about failure. And in the end, the people who cared enough to make mistakes were always the ones who transformed the fastest. 9. Feedback is gold. Correction had always been misunderstood by many learners. They often felt embarrassed or hurt when someone pointed out their mistakes. But in truth, every correction was a gift. It was free education delivered directly to them, shaped from real-life use of the language. Instead of wasting hours guessing what was wrong or repeating the same error again and again, they received the answer instantly. Feedback removed confusion and replaced it with clarity. When a teacher, a friend, or even a stranger corrected a learner's English, they were not attacking them. They were giving their time and energy to help. That act was a sign of care, not criticism. It showed that the other person had listened carefully enough to notice, and valued the learner's progress enough to share the right form. Seeing correction as an insult closed the door to growth. Seeing it as guidance opened the path forward. Each small piece of feedback held powerful value. One corrected word could change the way a learner spoke for years. A simple adjustment in pronunciation could transform understanding in future conversations. A corrected grammar mistake could save them from repeating the same confusion in every sentence. These little gifts stacked up, creating a foundation of stronger communication. Collecting feedback was like gathering gold coins. One coin might not seem enough, but over time, the collection became treasure. Learners who welcomed correction improved faster, because they built their skills directly from experience. Those who rejected feedback stayed stuck in the same patterns, blind to their own mistakes. The difference between slow growth and fast growth often came down to how much value a learner placed on correction. Feedback also carried another hidden lesson. It taught humility. To accept correction meant admitting imperfection, but it also meant showing the courage to improve. It turned the learner into someone who valued truth over pride. This shift created resilience, because once they stopped fearing correction, nothing could block their progress. Feedback was never an enemy. It was the sharp tool that shaped rough skills into polished ability. Every correction shortened the path, every suggestion smoothed the road, and every reminder strengthened memory. When learners embraced feedback as gold, they stopped feeling attacked and started feeling grateful. And gratitude transformed correction from something painful into something priceless. 10. Laugh at mistakes. Laughter had always been one of the strongest weapons against fear. When people treated their mistakes with heavy seriousness, those mistakes grew larger in their minds. They felt ashamed, nervous, and often avoided speaking again. But when they chose to laugh, something powerful happened. The fear lost its control. The mistake became smaller, almost harmless, and learning became much lighter. In English practice, errors happened all the time. A word pronounced in a strange way, a phrase put together incorrectly, or even a mix-up that created a completely different meaning often caused funny moments. Instead of feeling embarrassed, learners who laughed at themselves turned those moments into positive memories. They did not only learn the correct way, they also created joy while doing it. That joy made them want to try again instead of running away. Seriousness often killed motivation. A learner who demanded perfection from themselves felt pressure in every conversation. They were so afraid of looking foolish that they stayed silent. But silence never created progress. On the other hand, those who accepted that mistakes were natural, and even laughed at them, felt free. Their minds stayed open, their confidence grew, and their hearts stayed light. Laughter also created stronger memory. When an error was funny, the brain marked it as important, and the lesson stayed longer. A silly mistake remembered with a smile often became the reason a learner never forgot the correct word again. This natural connection between humor and memory made laughter a powerful learning tool. Sharing laughter with others built even more strength. When a group of learners laughed together at mistakes, the fear of judgment disappeared. Everyone understood they were on the same journey. The classroom or conversation became a safe space where people supported each other instead of competing. This bond made learning not only effective but also enjoyable. Mistakes would never disappear completely, no matter how advanced someone became. But by laughing at them, learners stopped fighting against the natural process of growth. They accepted errors as part of the adventure, and every laugh was a reminder that learning did not need to be heavy or painful. It could be filled with lightness, courage, and fun. Laughter turned mistakes into milestones. It changed fear into freedom and shame into strength. A learner who knew how to laugh at mistakes never stayed trapped by them. Instead, they walked forward with confidence, carrying both knowledge and joy. 11. Every expert was once a beginner. Fluency had always been the result of countless small mistakes. Every person who spoke English with confidence and grace had once stood where beginners stood. They had mispronounced simple words, confused grammar rules, and stumbled through basic sentences. Nobody escaped that stage. Even the speakers who now seemed perfect had once been full of errors. What set them apart was not luck or special talent but their willingness to keep going despite their imperfections. Each mistake left a trace that built understanding. Over time, those traces connected, forming a strong foundation of knowledge. Learners who dared to practice, even when it felt uncomfortable, discovered that every wrong word, every broken sentence, and every misunderstanding carried them forward. They did not wait for perfection before speaking. They spoke and became better through the process. Experts had simply collected more mistakes than others. A fluent speaker was not someone who never failed but someone who had failed more times than a beginner had even tried. Thousands of attempts created the ability to communicate without fear. Every fluent speaker admired today had once been corrected again and again. They had felt embarrassed, confused, and doubtful. But they had stayed in the game long enough for those mistakes to transform into mastery. The idea that talent created fluency was only a myth. What truly created fluency was tolerance for imperfection. Beginners who accepted errors as part of their journey grew stronger. Those who expected perfection from the start gave up too soon. Success came to those who stayed patient with their own progress. They understood that the road to mastery was built step by step, with each step marked by mistakes. Looking back, many experts laughed at their early errors. What once felt heavy and humiliating now looked small compared to how far they had traveled. This perspective proved that mistakes were not permanent stains but temporary markers of growth. Every expert story carried the same truth. At one time, they too had been beginners who struggled. The path was open to everyone. The only requirement was courage to continue through the messy parts of learning. Beginners who embraced mistakes eventually became confident speakers. They did not rise because they were born different, they rose because they endured the process. Fluency, in the end, was not about avoiding mistakes. It was about collecting enough of them until the language became natural, until the errors slowly faded into skill, and until the once beginner finally stood as an expert. 12. Record your progress. Yesterday's mistakes had always turned into today's victories, but this truth became clear only when learners kept track of their journey. Many people thought they were not improving because progress felt invisible day to day. But when they wrote things down, recorded their voices, or saved their notes, they created proof that learning was happening. A journal of mistakes and corrections became more than a notebook. It became a mirror that showed growth over time. At first, the pages were full of broken grammar, missing words, and uncertain spelling. Sentences looked clumsy, and the learner often felt frustrated. Yet with every correction, with every repeated attempt, the journal began to change. What once felt impossible slowly became natural. The grammar rule that had caused endless confusion eventually appeared in sentences without effort. The word that had been mispronounced again and again turned into a word spoken with ease. The simple act of recording errors transformed them into visible progress. Learners who recorded their voices heard this change even more clearly. In early recordings, hesitation and fear filled every sentence. The accent felt heavy, and the pauses seemed endless. But months later, when they listened again, they could hear confidence that had not been there before. They could notice smoother pronunciation, faster rhythm, and stronger expression. The difference was impossible to ignore. This evidence gave them motivation no teacher or book could provide. By keeping a record, mistakes stopped feeling like failures. They became steps on a staircase. Each page in the journal or each recording on the phone showed that the learner had moved one step higher. Looking back at the first attempts brought not shame but pride, because those mistakes had been necessary to reach the present level. The fear of errors grew weaker because the learner could now see that errors were temporary, while progress was permanent. Recording progress also created discipline. It reminded learners that improvement was not about one big moment of success but about many small actions repeated daily. When they looked at their notes, they could see proof that they had worked hard. When they felt discouraged, those pages whispered that they were not standing still. They were moving forward, even if the steps felt small. Over time, the record itself became a source of motivation. Reading old mistakes no longer brought embarrassment but gratitude, because each mistake had served a purpose. What once caused frustration had turned into strength. What once felt like a weakness had become automatic skill. Learners who saw this transformation inside their own journals developed unstoppable confidence. They no longer doubted if progress was real, because the evidence was written in their own hand and spoken in their own voice. Recording progress was not only a habit, it was a reminder of the journey. It proved that growth came slowly but surely, and that mistakes were not the end but the beginning. Yesterday's errors stood as proof of today's victories, and today's errors promised the victories of tomorrow. 13. Practice publicly. Hiding had always slowed growth, while showing built it stronger than anything else. Many learners believed they should wait until their English became perfect before using it in front of others, but that waiting only kept them silent and stuck. Real improvement happened when they stepped into the open, when they spoke in groups, posted online, or practiced with friends. Public practice created pressure, but it also created power. Mistakes made in front of others felt bigger, yet those very mistakes became unforgettable lessons. When someone spoke English only in private, progress moved slowly. They repeated the same safe exercises, corrected themselves silently, and stayed inside their comfort zone. But once they spoke publicly, their brain had to work harder. It needed to find words faster, listen more carefully, and respond under real conditions. That effort pushed them to grow. Every time they stumbled in front of others, they remembered the error more strongly than if they had studied alone. Public practice also brought accountability. When learners joined a group, attended a language exchange, or posted videos of themselves speaking, they could no longer hide. People listened, reacted, corrected, and encouraged. This feedback, even when small, became fuel. A stranger correcting pronunciation gave more impact than hours of silent reading. A friend laughing kindly at a funny mistake made the lesson unforgettable. By practicing publicly, learners collected these valuable experiences. At first, fear of judgment felt heavy. Many worried that others would laugh, criticize, or think less of them. But the reality was different. Most listeners respected the courage it took to try. They understood that speaking another language was hard. Instead of laughing with cruelty, they often offered support. Learners discovered that the fear in their head was greater than the reaction outside. The moment they faced that fear, their confidence grew. Each public attempt became training for real life. In the real world, English was not spoken in silent rooms with grammar books. It was spoken in shops, meetings, airports, and conversations with strangers. By practicing in front of others, learners prepared for those real moments. They trained their courage and built the habit of speaking even when nervous. The more they practiced in public, the less power fear had over them. Over time, what had once felt terrifying became natural. Posting online in English became routine. Speaking in groups no longer caused shaking hands or a racing heart. Instead, learners felt excitement. They began to look forward to using English publicly because they knew that every moment was a chance to grow. Their mistakes turned into milestones, and their progress became visible not only to themselves but to everyone around them. Practicing publicly was not about showing off, it was about opening doors. It gave learners the strength to face real communication, the discipline to continue improving, and the courage to be seen as imperfect. Growth came faster because it was no longer hidden. By stepping into the open, learners proved that hiding killed growth, but showing built it into something unstoppable. 14. Mistakes build resilience. The stronger the storm, the deeper the roots always rang true for learners who struggled with mistakes. Every error tested not only their knowledge but also their emotional strength. When someone mispronounced a word in class and felt the room pause, their heart beat faster, and embarrassment rushed in. Yet the real growth happened when they chose to continue instead of hiding. Each recovery from embarrassment added a layer of resilience. It showed them that mistakes did not end their journey but shaped it. In the beginning, many learners broke down easily when errors appeared. A single correction felt like a wound, and self-doubt grew quickly. They sometimes wanted to quit, to avoid the pain of looking foolish. But over time, each mistake gave them a chance to practice standing tall again. The more they experienced failure, the less fragile they became. Instead of being crushed by small errors, they learned to bend and recover, like trees in the wind. Resilience grew step by step. A forgotten word in a conversation trained patience. A failed test trained determination. A misunderstanding trained humility. Each mistake became a teacher of emotional strength. Learners realized that language learning was not only about grammar and vocabulary but also about building a stronger spirit. They learned to face their own weakness and come back with more courage than before. This resilience did not stay locked inside language learning. It spread into other areas of life. People who trained their courage through mistakes in English became more confident in business meetings, more patient in relationships, and more balanced in daily struggles. They carried the lesson that errors were not the end but the beginning of deeper growth. They became less afraid of criticism, less shaken by rejection, and more open to challenges. Mistakes shaped character in ways success never could. Success felt good but did not test limits. Mistakes forced learners to decide, give up or rise again. Every time they rose, their inner strength grew roots that no storm could pull out. They began to see themselves as unbreakable, not because they never failed, but because failure could no longer destroy them. Over months and years, these learners built a resilience that others admired. They walked into challenges with calmness, knowing that even if they failed, they would stand up again. Their errors became the silent architects of their strength. What once brought shame now built confidence. Their character was not shaped in the easy moments but in the storms of mistakes, and each storm left them stronger than before. 15. Turn fear into fuel. Transform fear into energy was more than a phrase. It became a way of thinking for those who faced challenges in learning. Fear had always been present when someone stood up to speak English, when their heart raced and their palms sweated. That fear at first looked like an enemy, a wall too high to climb. But in truth, it was a signal that the moment mattered. People feared only the things that had value, and that value could be turned into strength. Instead of letting fear paralyze them, learners discovered that they could use it as fuel. The nervous energy that once froze their voice could be redirected into action. When someone felt afraid before speaking, it showed that they cared about expressing themselves. That care was not weakness, it was proof of passion. They began to channel that energy into saying the words, even if imperfect. Each attempt turned the shaking inside their chest into a spark of progress. At first, the fear felt overwhelming. Many wanted to stay silent, believing mistakes would make others laugh. But when they pushed through, something changed. The moment they spoke despite fear, the weight on their shoulders grew lighter. They realized that fear was not a stop sign but a green light pointing toward growth. It always stood in front of the things they wanted most: confidence, fluency, freedom to communicate. Each time they acted despite fear, they transformed weakness into power. They learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to move forward with it. Fear became a companion on the journey, whispering that the path was important. And the more they acted, the more fear turned into excitement. What once paralyzed them now energized them, like fire warming instead of burning. Over time, learners started to welcome fear instead of avoiding it. They knew that when fear appeared, it meant they were standing at the edge of growth. They began to use it as a compass, guiding them toward the very challenges that would shape their skills and character. Fear no longer ruled them, it fueled them. Final note. Mistakes were not enemies, they were allies. They were proof that learners were alive, moving, learning, and growing. In life and in English, the road to mastery was paved with errors and lit by the fire of fear turned into courage. To stop fearing mistakes was to unlock their hidden gift. Every error carried strength inside it, waiting to be unwrapped. Those who dared to act despite fear rose higher than they ever imagined. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.